The call came on the Tuesday afternoon, while I had tubes running into both arms and the machine next to my bed, counting every heartbeat, like it didn't trust my body to do it on its own. I had been in the cardiac unit at St. Vincent's for 3 days by then. A blockage they caught just in time, the cardiologist said. Another hour and we'd be having a very different conversation. I remember staring at the ceiling tiles, that particular shade of institutional beige that exists nowhere else in the world except hospitals, and thinking about how quiet it was, how nobody had come. My son-in-law answered that question before I even had time to sit with it. My phone buzzed on the tray table, my daughter's name on the screen. I reached for it carefully, mindful of the IV line, and felt something loosen in my chest that had nothing to do with the blockage. Dad. Not a question. Not relief. Just a word to fill the space before the next one. Hey, sweetheart, I was just thinking about. Listen, I need to know if you're going to be out by the weekend. I thought I'd misheard her. The monitors beeped. A nurse passed in the hallway pushing a cart. Out? I said. Of the hospital. We've got Nathan's parents coming in from Portland on Saturday. They're staying through Tuesday, and we need the guest room. I already told them it would be ready. The guest room. My house had 1 guest room. My daughter and her husband had been living with me for 11 months. Iris, I said slowly. I'm in the cardiac unit. I know where you are, Dad. That's why I'm asking. The doctors must have some kind of timeline. I looked at the IV in my arm. I looked at the heart monitor. I thought about the word timeline, and what it meant to the man who'd raised her, who'd taught her to ride a bike in the parking lot of the Lutheran church on Maple, who'd sat outside her door the night her first boyfriend broke her heart and slid a cup of cocoa under the door because I didn't know what else to do. I don't know when they're releasing me, I said. It depends on, can you ask? Because we're kind of in a tight spot here. Something shifted in me then. Very quietly. Like a door closing in a room far away. I'll see what I can do, I said. Okay. Feel better. And she hung up. I set the phone back on the tray table. The machine next to me kept counting. 32 years. That's how long I'd been her father. 32 years, and she'd called to ask about a guest room. Let me back up because none of this happened in a vacuum. My name is Frank Calloway. I'm 67 years old. I spent 31 years as a civil engineer with the city of Columbus, Ohio. The kind of career where you spend a lot of time in windowless meetings arguing about drainage systems and leave behind a few bridges that will still be standing when everyone in that room is gone. I retired 4 years ago with a decent pension, a house I paid off, and the particular kind of tiredness that comes not from laziness, but from decades of showing up. My wife, Patricia, passed 8 years ago. Ovarian cancer. We had 19 months between the diagnosis and the end, which sounds like a long time until it isn't. I won't say more about that, except that she was the better half of everything I ever was, and the house got very large after she was gone. Iris is our only child. She got her mother's eyes and, I thought for a long time, her mother's heart. She grew up well, went to Ohio State, studied marketing, met a man named Derek at a company retreat 2 years after graduating. Derek was in sales, confident handshake, good at dinner conversation, the kind of man who always seems to be performing slightly above his actual level. I noticed that, but I kept it to myself. She loved him, and he made her laugh, and that was enough for me. They got married in 2019. Small ceremony, which I paid for. They moved into an apartment in Dublin, which is a suburb northwest of Columbus. Things seemed fine. Then the pandemic hit and Derek's company restructured, and he lost his position. Then Iris's agency downsized and she went to part-time. Then the lease on their apartment came up, and the new rate was, in their words, impossible. Just until we get back on our feet, Iris told me over the phone. 6 months, maybe 8, we'll cover utilities and groceries. I said yes. Of course I said yes. The house had 4 bedrooms, and I was eating dinner alone every night watching the news. I wanted to be useful. I wanted my daughter nearby. I told myself it was practical, and it was, for about the first 3 months. The utility payments stopped quietly, around month 4. I didn't make an issue of it. The groceries became selective. They'd buy what they wanted, and I'd quietly fill in the rest. Derek started working again, some remote consulting position he was vague about, and I'd catch fragments of his calls sometimes when I passed the hallway. A lot of confident talking, a lot of numbers, very little that sounded concrete. Iris went back to full-time in the spring. I knew because she bought a new car, a Lexus SUV, and came home with it on a Thursday afternoon, and I watched from the living room window as they stood in the driveway talking about the color. Nobody mentioned moving out. I told myself it was fine. I told myself they were saving up. I told myself my daughter's laughter in the kitchen on Sunday mornings was worth whatever the arrangement cost me. And I mostly believed it. The way you believe something you've decided to believe. What I didn't know, what I wouldn't find out until much later, was that Derek had been telling people, including apparently his own parents, that the house was going to be his and Iris's within the year, that my health was declining, that things were being sorted out. I didn't know any of that yet. I was just a retired man living with my daughter, counting down to a retirement that kept feeling smaller than I'd expected. And then my heart decided it had been patient long enough. The blockage was in the left anterior descending artery. The cardiologist, a compact woman named Dr. Ose, who had the kind of calm that only comes from years of delivering very serious news, told me they'd placed a stent and I'd need to stay for monitoring. No strenuous activity for 6 weeks. Cardiac rehab twice a week. Dietary changes. The usual remaking of a life around the malfunction. I called Iris from the ER the night it happened. She didn't answer. I left a voicemail. She texted back 20 minutes later. OMG, Dad. Keep us posted. Then nothing until that Tuesday call about the guest room. Derek came once. Day 2. He stood at the door to my room for about 4 minutes, asked if I needed anything, checked his phone twice, and said he had a call he couldn't miss. I told him I was fine. He nodded and left, and I watched the door close and thought, there it is. My neighbor, a retired school teacher named Beverly, who had lived across the street from us since Patricia and I first moved in, came on day 3 with a thermos of soup and sat with me for 2 hours. She's 71 and drives a 10-year-old Honda and brings soup to everyone on the block when something goes wrong. Some people are just built that way. She asked about Iris. I didn't say much. Beverly has known my daughter since she was 7 years old, and the look on Beverly's face when I changed the subject told me she'd drawn her own conclusions. On day 5, my old colleague Ray, we'd worked together for nearly 20 years, he runs the city's infrastructure planning now, stopped by after work. We talked about the Bengals, about his grandkids, about a viaduct replacement project I'd consulted on before I retired. Normal things, good things. I felt, for the first time since the hospital, like myself. He asked how I was fixed for help when I got home. I'll be all right, I said. Iris and Derek are at the house. Something moved across Ray's face. Good, he said. That's good. But he pulled out a notepad and wrote down his cell number and his wife's cell number and set it on my tray table like he wasn't entirely sure it was good. I got out on day 8. Beverly picked me up because I hadn't asked Iris and I didn't intend to. The house felt different the moment I walked in. Not dramatically. Not movies different where you walk in and everything is smashed and spray-painted. Just off. Like a room that's been rearranged and then rearranged back, but not quite to the original positions. My recliner, the brown leather one I've had since 2009, was pushed into the corner. There was a new sectional sofa taking up most of the living room. Large, gray microfiber, the kind you see in those staged home photos. It was not my couch. There was a television mounted on the wall. I had not owned a wall-mounted television. I had a perfectly good 55-inch on a stand that had, apparently, been moved to the garage. In the kitchen, the cabinet where I keep my cast iron and my mother's ceramic mixing bowls had been reorganized. A new espresso machine sat on the counter. A big stainless one, the kind that costs $600 or $700. I stood in my kitchen for a long moment. Beverly had come in behind me and was being very quiet. I'll make us some coffee, she said finally. Iris came downstairs about 10 minutes later. She was surprised to see me. I could tell by the half-second delay before she arranged her face into a welcoming expression. Dad, you should have called. You look tired. Sit down. Whose couch is that? I said. We thought the living room needed some updating. It was so dark in there. Where is my couch? The garage. It's fine. It's not damaged. And the television? Dad, you can barely operate the remote on the old one. This one has Iris. I said her name the way I used to when she was 16, and I'd caught her in something. Just her name. She stopped. We can talk about all of this, okay? You just got home. You should rest. Where's Derek? He's working. I nodded. I sat down in my recliner, which I had dragged back from the corner myself, and Beverly brought me coffee and sat across from me, and we talked about the garden until Iris drifted back upstairs. What I didn't show, what I had learned over 3 decades of city council meetings and contract disputes, was that I had already decided something. I just hadn't decided all of it yet. The thing about being a civil engineer is that you spend your career solving problems that other people created. A road washes out, a bridge develops a crack, a drainage system fails because someone cut corners 15 years ago and now the consequences are someone else's problem. You learn to assess before you act. You learn that emotion is useful information but a poor tool. You look at the damage, you figure out the cause, and then you make a plan. Over the next week, walking 20 minutes a day as Dr. Osei had instructed, eating the low-sodium meals I was now apparently responsible for cooking myself since nobody offered. I started to put things together. The espresso machine. I'd seen the receipt on the kitchen counter. 11 days before I came home. Derek had ordered it during my hospitalization. The sectional, Beverly, bless her, had noticed the delivery truck while I was at St. Vincent's. She'd mentioned it carefully, watching my face. I checked my home equity account online. Nobody had touched it. I was the only signatory and I'd never shared access. But I pulled up the county auditor's website and looked up my property. And I found something. There had been an inquiry. Not a transfer, not a completed transaction. Just an inquiry, a request for title information, filed 11 days into my hospitalization by an attorney's office I didn't recognize. The kind of inquiry you make when you're preparing to do something with a property. I sat with that for a long time. Then I called my own attorney, a straightforward man named Hartley, who'd handled Patricia's estate and who I trusted precisely because he was not the kind of man who dramatizes things. I described what I'd found. He was quiet for a moment. Frank, he said, don't touch anything yet. Let me make some calls. What Hartley found over the next few days was not a crime. Not quite. Derek had apparently consulted with a real estate attorney about the possibility of a deed transfer, citing what he described as my declining health and Iris's status as my only heir. The attorney had requested title information as a preliminary step. When Hartley contacted their office, they became suddenly very careful with their language. No transaction had been initiated. No documents had been signed. The inquiry had gone nowhere, possibly because I had not, in fact, died on schedule. But the intention was clear enough. I sat in my recliner on a Thursday evening while Iris and Derek moved around the kitchen making dinner. They had started, recently, to be somewhat more domestic, as if proximity to the cardiac event had recalibrated something. And I thought about the word intention. My daughter had not, I believed, been the architect of this. Iris had grown up selfish in the way that children of comfortable circumstances sometimes do. Not malicious, just insufficiently aware of the distance between what she wanted and what she was entitled to. Derek was something else. Derek had done the math on my house, my pension, my age and my health, and had run a calculation. I thought about the Portland trip that never materialized. I thought about the espresso machine ordered while I was in the hospital. I thought about a man standing in the doorway of my hospital room for 4 minutes and then leaving. I thought about what Patricia would have said. She'd have said, "Frank, you let this go too long." She'd have been right. After dinner, while Derek was in the other room, I asked Iris to sit with me. She sat in the new chair, the grey sectional, and I sat in my brown recliner, and I looked at my daughter for a long moment before I spoke. "I know about the title inquiry," I said. Her face did several things in rapid succession. "What?" "Derek had an attorney request title information on this house while I was in the hospital. I'd like to know how much of that you knew." "Dad, that's not—" He was just being practical. He was worried about Iris. Again, just her name. She was quiet. Her hands were in her lap. "I don't think you planned it," I said. "I think Derek planned it, and you let yourself not ask questions, which is its own kind of choice." She started to cry. I didn't move toward her, and I noticed that I didn't want to, and that fact told me something important about how far we'd gotten from where we started. "I need you both to be out of this house by the end of next month," I said. "I'll give you 30 days. "Dad, I've already spoken with an attorney. The process is straightforward. I hope you'll choose to make it simple. You're kicking your own daughter out. I'm asking my daughter and her husband to live in their own home, which they should have done a year ago." She cried harder. I sat and watched her and felt the particular sadness of a man who loves someone and is no longer willing to be undone by it. "I'm not cutting you off," I said. "You're my daughter. That's permanent. But this arrangement is over, and what Derek tried to do has consequences. Where are we supposed to go? You have 2 incomes and no debt that I know of. You'll find somewhere. I'll give you whatever the deposit is as a gift, not a loan. But you'll go." She left the room. I heard her and Derek talking upstairs, his voice low and controlled, hers uneven. I turned on the television, the new wall-mounted one which I was going to sell, and watched the news until the house got quiet. They left in 26 days. Derek said almost nothing to me directly. On the last morning, he loaded boxes into the Lexus with the focused efficiency of a man pretending he has no feelings about something, which is different from actually having no feelings. Iris hugged me at the door, a real hug, the kind that meant something even if neither of us quite knew what. "I'm sorry, Dad," she said, into my shoulder very quietly. "I know," I said. After they drove away, Beverly came over with a coffee cake and we sat at the kitchen table and talked for a while, and then she went home and I walked through the house by myself. I moved my television back off the wall and put it on its stand. I put the sectional on Facebook Marketplace and sold it within 2 days to a young couple in Westerville for $600. I found my mother's ceramic mixing bowls, still in the cabinet, untouched, and I ran my hand along the edge of the largest one, the way I always do. I had the espresso machine boxed up and donated it to the church rummage sale. I don't drink espresso. I enrolled in cardiac rehab, Tuesdays and Thursdays, at the hospital's wellness center, and I started walking 40 minutes a day, then 50. I rearranged the living room back to something close to how Patricia had it, which I probably should have done 3 years ago. Hartley sent Derek a letter on my behalf, formal and brief, noting that any future inquiry into my property or estate without my knowledge would be treated as a legal matter. Derek did not respond. I didn't expect him to. Iris called on a Sunday evening, about 6 weeks after they moved out. She was in an apartment in Grandview. She'd sent me the address. She asked how I was doing. I told her about cardiac rehab, about the neighbor's dog who had taken to walking with me in the mornings, about a Bengals game I'd watched with Ray and his wife the previous weekend. She told me about the apartment, about a new project at work, about a farmer's market she'd found nearby. We talked for 40 minutes. It was the most we'd really talked, in probably 2 years. I didn't bring up Derek, neither did she. "Are you eating well?" she asked before we hung up. "Beverly brings things over," I said. "I'm fine. I could come on Sunday. I could make that chicken thing you like." I paused. "Yeah," I said. "I'd like that." She came on Sunday. She made the chicken. We sat at the kitchen table where her mother and I had sat for 20 years, And we had a meal, and it was not like before, it couldn't be, but it was something. It was a beginning that knew what it was, which is rarer and more valuable than a beginning that doesn't. I am 67 years old. I have a stent in my left anterior descending artery, and a pension and a paid-off house, and a neighbor who brings soup, and a daughter who is, I think, figuring out who she is without someone doing her figuring for her. Patricia would have said, it took long enough. She'd have been right, but we got there. I keep coming back to that Tuesday afternoon. The monitor's beeping, the IV in my arm, the ceiling tiles I memorized by day 3, and my daughter's voice asking when I'd be out so they could prep the guest room for company. There's a version of that moment where I get angry, where I call her back and say something I can't take back. There's another version where I say nothing and let it calcify inside me, the way a lot of things had been calcifying for 11 months. I didn't do either. I set the phone down, and something in me got very quiet and very clear, the way things sometimes get when the noise finally stops. What I've come to understand is that none of what happened was sudden. Derek didn't wake up one morning and decide to be the kind of man who consults a real estate attorney while his father-in-law is in intensive care. Iris didn't become someone who calls about a guest room in a single phone call. These things grew in the silence I provided. Every time I looked away from a bill they didn't pay. Every time I told myself it was fine when it wasn't. I was teaching them what I would accept. I was training them, without meaning to, in exactly the wrong lessons. I think about that a lot now, the way we communicate what we're worth by what we're willing to tolerate. What saved me, and I mean that plainly, not dramatically, was that I still had my wits about me. 67 years old, a stent in my chest, and I still knew how to read a county property record and make a phone call to Hartley before anything irreversible happened. That clarity, the ability to look at a situation without flinching from what it actually was, that's something I worked to keep my whole life. Patricia used to say I was the least sentimental engineer she'd ever met, by which she meant I didn't let what I wanted to be true crowd out what was true. I was grateful for that in those weeks. Sentimentality would have cost me my house. But knowing what's right and actually doing it are two separate acts, and the distance between them is where most people get stuck. I've watched men my age, good men, decent men, let their children hollow them out slowly because the alternative felt like a kind of failure. As if being a good father meant absorbing whatever came at you. I don't believe that anymore. I think the harder and more honest thing is to hold a line, to say this ends here, even when the person on the other side of that line is someone you love, especially then. Iris came on that Sunday. She made the chicken. We sat at the table where her mother and I had sat for 20 years, and we talked about ordinary things. And it wasn't the relationship we'd had before. It was something more real than that. It was two people who knew exactly where the edges were and had chosen to be at the table anyway. I'm not interested in a version of fatherhood that costs me everything I have left. I am interested in a version where my daughter becomes someone her mother would recognize. I think we're working on that now, slowly, one Sunday at a time. That's enough for me. That's more than enough.